So I want to start by saying how happy I am to be here with so many of the scholars whose work inspired my own work on John Ferguson, and also to thank the Metropolitan Museum, especially the Asian Art Department and the archives, where I've really been able to dig into the complexities of John Ferguson's career. Ferguson arrived in China in 1887 as a missionary. 25 years later, he was hired as a purchasing agent for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This was a primary event in Ferguson's late-blooming career in Chinese art. And this is important. Tonight I'm talking about the beginning of Ferguson's Chinese art career. Ferguson bought for the Met, as we've heard, nearly 200 Chinese paintings that ranged in date, in Ferguson's understanding, from the 7th to the 19th century. And based on this collection, he appeared as a pioneer who, thanks to his decades in China, appreciated the type of paintings created and collected by Chinese scholars, the literati painting of the Ming and Qing dynasties. In contrast, it has seemed, the few others that collected Chinese painting in the United States at this time were guided by the theories of the late Ernest Fenollosa, who'd been curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Influenced by the years he had spent in Japan, Fenollosa argued that Sung Dynasty Chinese painting, long treasured in Japan, had achieved transcendent representation. The calligraphic painting of the Ming and Qing dynasty was nothing more than meaningless brushwork in Fenollosa's eyes. For those of you who don't spend your day immersed in Chinese history, here's an outline of the dynasties. Notice the Qing dynasty rulers were ethnically Manchu, because I'll be talking about some Manchu collectors tonight. Upon close examination, the tidy opposition between Ferguson and his contemporaries gets messy. In 1913, Hayasaki Kokichi bought fans for the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, that we might have guessed were in the Ferguson collection. And collectors in Japan, who haven't yet been considered in relation to Ferguson but must be, bought paintings that Ferguson saw in Peking in 1912, but that he wasn't given the opportunity to buy. The burgeoning international art market in Peking, just after the Chinese Revolution of 1911, was competitive and it was stratified, with at least some Chinese and Manchu dealers saving their best paintings for those who recognized them and passing off copies to those less discerning. Complicating the demand side was the ongoing process of professionalization at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So let me now give you some background on John Ferguson and the Chinese art field. Ferguson was born in Ontario in 1866, the son of a Methodist minister. He moved to Boston to finish college, earning his BA at Boston University. Art history wasn't offered at Boston University in the late 1880s. Ferguson's knowledge of art would be completely self-taught. Afraid my pages have got a little mixed up. In 1887, at age 21, Ferguson traveled to China to serve at the Methodist Mission in Nanking. He spent 10 years there, where he became fluent in Chinese, founded the city's first Western-style university, and began to form connections with the Qing government officials. In 1897, he was invited to Shanghai by the powerful industrialist and bureaucrat Sheng Xuanhuai. Ferguson's work for Sheng led him to be employed by Duanfang, the Qing governor-general and ambitious collector of antiquities and paintings. In Shanghai, he was also an especially active member of the North China branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. In this first decade of the 20th century, both Ferguson and the Royal Asiatic Society embraced the crystallizing field of Chinese art. Exhibitions and lectures reflected and encouraged a rising tide of interest in paintings and objects from China as art. And Ferguson, for the first time, had regular opportunity to see and appreciate art objects. But no evidence suggests that he saw many paintings. In 1908, when the Royal Asiatic Society sponsored Exhibition of Old Chinese Porcelain and Works of Art, Ferguson encouraged Duanfang to donate 3 early ceramics. But we shouldn't imagine Ferguson coaxing a reluctant Qing officials to open his collection. Duanfang had sent antiquities to international and domestic exhibitions in St. Louis and Osaka, and he invited Charles Freer, the founder of the Freer Gallery of Art, to see his collected paintings in Tianjin in 1909. In the United States, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston had been a pioneer in adding to its collection the Chinese and Japanese paintings acquired in Japan by Ernest Fenollosa and fellow Bostonians. In 1904, the Boston Museum hired Okakura Tenshin, an articulate exponent of the theory that the classical art traditions of Asia had been best preserved and perpetuated in Japan. But theory aside, Okakura traveled to China in 1906 and again in 1911 to buy paintings for the Boston Museum. And Charles Freer focused on acquiring Chinese paintings from the time of his trip to China in 1909 until his death in 1919. The Metropolitan Museum had, by my count, just 3 paintings from China in its collection in 1911. Clearly, it was falling behind. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 cut short Ferguson's career in the Qing government. While in the United States in May of 1912, Ferguson evidently approached J.P. Morgan and Robert DeForest, president and vice president of the Board of Trustees at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, about the possibility that he might buy Chinese art for their museum. Morgan and DeForest were at this time developing the Metropolitan into a modern European class museum. They took as their models the Louvre with its collection of masterpieces and a cluster of new Berlin museums where Wilhelm Baudet was hiring academically trained curators and arranging objects according to newly defined art historical chronologies. Morgan and DeForest oversaw the authentication of the Met's collection, the acquisition of new artworks, and the selection of curators for multiple new departments. The Department of Far Eastern Art, by the way, wouldn't be formed until 1915, 2 years after the episode I'm talking about today. Ferguson must have seemed just the man to choose Chinese paintings for the museum, and he was contracted to do just that in the spring of 1912. So now let's move with Ferguson to Peking. He arrived in the Chinese capital in June of 1912, and in his view, he found Chinese paintings in abundance. In late July, he wrote to DeForest that he'd bought paintings which, in his words, will be found by your museum to be the highest class work which has ever found its way to the Occident. By December, he was able to send to New York 120 paintings. This first shipment included scrolls attributed to the most highly regarded Sung and Yuan dynasty painters, 2 albums of Ming dynasty fans that Ferguson described as very cheap, and an album of 6 leaves attributed to the Sung dynasty masters celebrated for their orthodox literati style. But when Ferguson's shipment arrived, the museum staff found that the paintings didn't match Ferguson's superlative descriptions. DeForest requested that Ferguson not buy anything more unless he was able to first send pictures. But Ferguson had already used up his entire $50,000 advance by the time he received this letter, and even then he couldn't pass up great opportunities. He didn't send pictures. He spent his own money to buy 70 more paintings and brought these to the Met in person in November of 1913. The Met officials proposed to buy just half of the second group, but Ferguson offered the rest as a gift, insisting that these formed an integral part of a collection that was meant to be, in his words, representative of the development of Chinese painting. How was it that John Ferguson, who'd only had significant contact with art objects in the 1900s, could find all that he desired in Chinese painting, as he said? His perception of immediate success arose from an initial group of paintings that he acquired through Tsai Naihuang, who Ferguson had met as an official in Shanghai in 1908. Ferguson recorded that Tsai had financial interest, probably a commission, in helping him to buy 7 paintings from the collection of Shu Fu, a former Qing minister of rights. The works with Cai Xu provenance include landscape, believed by Ferguson to be by Dong Yuan of the 10th century, and mountain scenery, believed by Ferguson to be by Guo Xi of the Song dynasty. And finally, returning home, thought by Ferguson to be by Qian Xuan of the Yuan dynasty, and still considered a close copy of a work by that painter. Cai's willingness to attest to the authenticity of paintings attributed to 10th century and Song dynasty masters with long colophons make his honesty as a middleman suspect. And Ferguson wrote that Cai had other paintings that he wasn't willing to sell, suggesting that as long as Ferguson could be convinced to buy a Guo Xi that was painted in the Ming or Qing dynasty, Cai had no incentive to find him an older work. One wonders just how Ferguson acquired returning home, but Ferguson hasn't left us with any clues. After some time, Ferguson began to have contact with 2 much better known art world figures, Wanyan Jingxian and Jin Sheng. Wanyan Jingxian, usually called just Jingxian, was a connoisseur and an active dealer. He was a member of the Manchu Wanyan clan that had enjoyed wealth and power since the 17th century. He and John Ferguson evidently had an encounter of some kind in 1912, before Ferguson made his first shipment to the Met. For Ferguson noted in regard to Album of Flowers and Birds, "One leaf is missing. It was taken from the album without my knowledge by Jingxian." And obviously this is one of the leaves that made it to the Met. In April and again in August, Ferguson visited Jingxian's home and viewed a total of 7 paintings, including this one by Li Cheng, and 10 horses, which Ferguson believed to date to the Tang dynasty. Among the scrolls that he saw with Jingxian, he bought only this one. But in contrast to Ferguson's single acquisition, Okakura Tenshin bought at least 4 scrolls and an album from Jingxian in 1911-1912 for the MFA Boston. This group includes Clear Weather in the Valley and Harp Player in a Pavilion. It seems quite clear that Jingxian did not give Ferguson the opportunity to buy paintings of the same quality that he offered to Okakura Tenshin. Moreover, he might have helped himself to desirable paintings in Ferguson's hands. I don't have time tonight to look closely at the paintings I'm showing, but I'm sure you can see the contrast between the atmospheric Dong Yuan that Okakura bought and the more linear and conventional brushwork of Ferguson's Qing dynasty Dong Yuan. Jin Sheng, the second of Ferguson's noteworthy contacts, was an artist and a collector. And here we have a work by Jin Sheng in the Metropolitan's collection. He was also a Secretary of State Affairs in the Chinese Republican government who was very influential in promoting and preserving traditional Chinese paintings and objects. The paintings in the Met's Ferguson collection that are associated with Jin Sheng include bamboo studies thought by Ferguson to be by Wu Zhen of the Yuan dynasty. Jin Sheng bought Ferguson to buy this work from the collection of Bao Xi, a Manchu, and a Jin Shi degree holder. The album of fans that Ferguson thought to be by Qing dynasty Orthodox masters also came from the collection of Bao Xi, but no records link them to Jin Sheng. The fans, such as these 2, formerly attributed to Wang Yuanqi and Wang Shimin, now seem to be forgeries. Nothing very good, we can see, came to the Met from Bao Xi, whether from Jin Sheng or not. But there are important paintings in American collections with Jin Sheng provenance. At the Metropolitan, Drinking in the Bamboo Garden has Jin Sheng's seal and must have passed through his hands, although Ferguson bought the painting from De Baozhai on Liu Lichang, Beijing's historic market for antiquities. The Freer Gallery of Art has 4 paintings with Jin Sheng's seal, including this one. Jin Sheng was a prominent political and cultural figure in Republican-era Peking, and he obviously had access to good paintings, but he didn't offer them to Ferguson. Among Ferguson's purchases from Cai Naihuang, Jingxian, and Jin Sheng So far, only Returning Home has stood out from the mass of anonymous Ming and Qing works. But Ferguson did a little better, buying from Liu Lichang shops and from a number of collectors whose identity remains obscure. Maybe he benefited from having gained a little experience, in contrast to his first purchases from Tsai, and from not putting himself at the mercy of Peking's most shrewd collectors, such as Jing Xian. Debaozhai, where Ferguson bought Drinking in the Bamboo Garden, was the source for many of the late imperial paintings that intrigue us today. Most importantly, the albums of very cheap fans, 48 fans in total, came from this shop. Some leaves aren't believed anymore to be by the star literati artists of the Ming Dynasty, but the majority of the fans retain their original attributions. Highlights of the two albums include these two and these two calligraphies. From De Zhenzhai and Liu Lichang, Ferguson bought an album of paintings that he believed dated to the Song and Yuan period. A second comparable album came from an as-yet unidentified Xu Ling Ho of Peking. While many of the leaves from these albums are dated to later dynasties, they also include some lovely early works. I mentioned above the paintings that Okakura bought from Wanyan Jingxian. Let's now look at some of the other foreign buyers that were active in early 20th century Chinese painting market. Okakura's step-nephew, Hayasaki Kokichi, was a painter and a resident of China. He was also an agent for the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, buying in 1913 a group of 45 paintings. As we might expect, these are mostly early paintings, as well as work by Ming Dynasty professional painters who followed Song traditions. Here's one example, formerly attributed to Fan Quan. However, Hayasaki's purchases also included an album of 10 fans by Qing Dynasty Orthodox artists. We can suppose that this album, with two examples on the screen by Wu Li and Wang Yuanqi, this is what Ferguson imagined he was buying from Baoshi, rather than the later paintings on fans, the forged paintings that I showed earlier. Hayasaki's album hints at a crucial change in the Chinese painting market in the early 20th century. As Ida Yuan Wang has demonstrated, political instability in China, increased contact between Chinese and Japanese scholars and collectors, and Japan's own cultural politics drove up the availability and the appreciation of literati painting in Taisho-era Japan. Prosperous Japanese industrialists had unprecedented opportunities to see and buy not just superb early paintings, but also Ming and Qing dynasty works that were eye-opening in their quality and their diversity. We can say that the MFA Boston was guided by Japanese taste in its Chinese art collection in the early 20th century. But the preferences of Japanese connoisseurs were approaching those of the Chinese in this time of intense Sino-Japanese contact. The sinologist, art dealer, and collector Naito Konan wrote in the 1930s that of the paintings predating the Song dynasty that were once owned by Wanyan Jingxian, 2/3 had come to our nation, Japan, and of those, 1/2 were owned by Abe Fusajiro. Naito played a critical role in introducing paintings in Jingxian's hands to collectors such as the Osaka textile magnate Abe Fusajiro. Abe's extensive Chinese art collection would be given to the Osaka Municipal Museum of Fine Art in 1943. The paintings with Jingxian provenance now in that museum include this one, and the Northern Song Dynasty reading the memorial stele. We recall, of course, that this work was one that Ferguson saw in Jingxian's collection. But Abe didn't just buy the ancient paintings proudly mentioned by Naito Konan. A prized work in his collection is this one by Dong Qichang, the late Ming artist and theorist who was so influential in defining literati style in his time and in the centuries to come. Before concluding, let me briefly mention the Chinese paintings that Charles Freer collected in the last decade of his life. And here I'm drawing on the recent research of Ingrid Larson. Freer shopped in China in the years 1909 through 1911, but from different Liu Lichang shops than Ferguson. After suffering from a stroke in 1911, Freer selected paintings from those brought to him in the United States by a network of primarily Shanghai-based dealers, including the very prominent collector Pang Yuanji. But when we look at the provenance of some of the finest paintings in Freer's collection, we begin to see traces of the collectors I've been talking about today. This work, we know, has Jin Sheng's seal on it, and it was bought from Pang Yuanji. This northern Song masterpiece was formerly owned by Duanfang and has the seal of Wanyan Jingxian. Pang Yuanji earned a commission to sell this work to Freer on behalf of Jingxian. The interconnections between suppliers of Chinese painting deserves further research, but at this point we can see the link between Pang Yuanji and Jingxian as further evidence that Jingxian was adept at getting high-quality paintings into the hands of collectors that demanded them. So now to conclude. In Shanghai in the 1900s, Ferguson was one of the first to be involved in the modern field of Chinese art. But his activities in no way prepared him for his encounter with China's sophisticated traditions of Chinese painting and of forgery. Most confounding for Ferguson must have been the fluidity between what might be called an original, a copied, and a spurious painting. In China, it's not so shameful to own or sell a forged painting. As the art historian Wen Feng, we heard about Wen Feng from Mike Hearn earlier, as Wen Feng said, if someone's gullible enough to own, to buy, and derive pleasure from forgeries, why spoil the poor man's illusions? Ferguson wasn't unaware of the ubiquity of copying in the Chinese painting tradition, but he maintained an earnest and, I believe, emotionally driven belief in the importance of the paintings he'd bought for the Met. Ferguson's task in 1912 to buy genuine Chinese paintings for the Metropolitan wasn't one that any Westerner could fully accomplish at the time. Ferguson was new to art appreciation, but Charles Freer, who was very experienced and committed to judging aesthetic quality, inadvertently bought Ming and Qing paintings as well. So let's keep in mind that if Ferguson, with 25 years of experience in China and strong connections to the ruling elite, was ill prepared to buy Chinese paintings, how difficult that market must have been. How critical Ferguson would have had to have been to distrust paintings offered to him by the former officials that he considered his peers. Given the existing understanding of John Ferguson as a collector who brought paintings in the Chinese taste to New York, I've brought us to perhaps an unexpected conclusion, that to gather at this early date a collection of Chinese paintings that would have satisfied the new 20th century museum standards, the Met trustees might have done better to engage an artist or sinologist who was trained in Japan. A more cautious man than Ferguson might have bought little in Peking in 1912. Instead, Ferguson strode boldly into the quicksands of Chinese painting connoisseurship that I think many of you know well, pulling the Metropolitan Museum along with him. In his determination to assemble a representative collection of Chinese art, and with his faith in his Chinese advisors, he did acquire some beautiful examples of both early and late Chinese painting. For the Met, the Ferguson purchase was a rocky but a productive beginning to what's now, almost to the month, 100 years of Chinese art collection and scholarship. For John Ferguson, meeting with dealers in Peking to select paintings for the New York Museum, and then poring over traditional Chinese painting texts in an effort to catalog these works, was a crucial step towards becoming the scholar and collector we remember today. In the decades to come, Ferguson would assemble a well-regarded private collection and publish reference books on paintings and bronzes in Chinese that are still used by art historians of China today. But that's the next chapter in Ferguson's story. Thank you.